Welcome to another episode of BRI Scholar Talks. My name is Mary Patterson, and I work on the content team here at the Bill of Rights Institute. And today, I'm joined by BRI's very own in-house scholar, Senior Fellow Tony Williams. Hello, Tony.
Hi, Mary. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. So typically on this series, Tony sits down with a scholar, an author that contributed to BRI's new free online U.S. history resource entitled Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. Tony, however, is a published author and scholar in his own right, and he was also one of our authors on this project. Today, the tables have turned. He's in the hot seat, and I get to ask the questions. We will be talking about what I think is fair to say a seminal event in American history and memory, the Boston Massacre. Now, I want this conversation to remain civil, Tony, so I will not say anything about the Boston Red Sox. I will keep
Thank you.
purely in the time period itself. So let's dive in, shall we? Before we get to the event itself, can you set the scene for us a little bit? What is Boston like in the years leading up to 1770?
Sure. And that's a really important question for understanding how, the events that shaped the Boston Massacre itself, but then also, the colonists' understanding of that event. Boston was kind of a seedbed, kind of a hotbed of revolutionary fervor, kind of resistance against British tyranny. In 1767, the British had passed the Townshend Acts, which were a series of taxes on various items without the colonists' consent. And so they were very upset about that. And Samuel Adams, and the legislature protested against that, the Sons of Liberty. And this was true across the colonies as well. And there was a colonial-wide boycott of British goods. And in addition to that, the British sent a couple of regiments up to Boston. So, by 1768-69, there's some 4,000 troops or so up in Boston. And both of those facts are very important because, the Americans feel as if their economic liberties are being taken away, their right to govern themselves by their own consent is taken away. By the way, the governor had suspended the legislature in response to these protests. And so their political rights were taken away. And on top of that, the British standing army during peacetime really seemed to be the very essence of tyranny. And I don't think we quite can capture that in 2020. But the colonists are really outraged that there were British troops on American soil, and they were being quartered in their buildings and homes. This went all the way back to the English Bill of Rights in 1689. This fear of a standing army and this fear of a loss of liberty because of that. So practically, in the events sort of leading up to the massacre, there's just a lot of tension with those troops. There's a lot of, sort of, as I said, political and economic outrage, but even when the Townshend Acts are repealed, there's just still a lot of popular outrage, and they're getting into fistfights with the troops. Insults are being hurled back and forth in taverns and in streets. Some of the British soldiers get part-time jobs. They kind of moonlight, and they seem to be competing with Americans for jobs. And so there's just a great deal of tension. And then in February of 1770, there's this mob action that takes place with some people who are sort of pro-British and sort of Tories, you might say, and they're not following the boycott. And sort of violence erupts, and a young 11-year-old boy is killed. And Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty use that as propaganda, and they really publicize his funeral and make a lot of hash out of it to demonstrate for them what seemed like British tyranny. This was just yet another example. And so all that is very important long-term and short-term for setting up the events of March 5th.
I think that, so Boston in 1770, we've seen years of protests and boycotts. You have this standing army in the city, like you said. I think that is something that we're typically familiar with when we read a textbook, but the death of this 11-year-old boy in this skirmish a month before the Boston Massacre is something I was not familiar with. I know that's something that you mentioned in the essay that you've written for our textbook, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. But I think it's like a key part of the story to understand just how tense and how fraught the air is in Boston leading up to this event. So I'd
Right,
like to,
and to think about the propaganda associated, right? Samuel Adams, and you know, there's a funeral procession through the streets, sort of thousands of people witness this, and you know, everyone's kind of blood is boiling. You know, everyone's kind of, you know, there's a lot of anxiety in the city, a lot of tension. It's just like a powder keg, and just would need sort of a match to explode. So.
okay, so blood is boiling. It's March 5th, 1770. So this is the date of the Boston Massacre. Can you walk us through the event itself? Like who started it? What happened? Like give us the blow by blow.
Sure. So the Sons of Liberty and sort of this mob, if you will, come out into the streets. You know, it's sort of a cold night. There's ice on the ground, and so people start taunting a British sentry who's all alone, and they're throwing ice at him and snowballs, rocks, cobblestones, whatever sort of nearby, bric-a-brac, and the British Guard is roused and comes out to sort of, you know, get him to safety and protect his life. You know, and a larger and larger mob assembles. People, you know, a fire bell rings out, and so more and more people spill out into the street because they think there's a fire, and so there's some anxiety that way as well. And people the people around the soldiers continue to pelt them with these objects, right, and insult them and call them names, call them lobster backs, and all sorts of things because of their red coats. And and there's a lot of confusion about what actually really happened. Even today, we're still unsure about sort of how things really happened, which is interesting, right? In history, we don't always necessarily have all the answers. The best we can piece together is that there's some actual physical violence between the soldiers and the townspeople. A soldier either slips on the ice or is knocked down, gets up. People in the crowd are supposedly yelling "fire, fire." They're sort of provoking the troops into firing, and they do. They're lined up and they do discharge their weapons into the crowd, and uh, 5 people are either killed outright or die, you know, sort of the next day, and others are wounded actually, all right. And this creates a real explosive situation, you know, because, you know, there may be further outbreaks of violence, and people may retaliate from the crowd, and, you know, this fear that the soldiers might fire again. And so fortunately, the troops are removed from Boston. And so some calm is restored in the next several hours and days.
It's interesting that you mentioned the fire bell was ringing. That's something I didn't know, that part of the story. So that adds like a different dimension of people yelling out fire. Of course, a fire in 1770 is catastrophic. So
Right.
it's dark, it's cold, it sounds like really chaotic time. So it's, as you said, it's hard to see, you know, to know exactly what happened. So that's both the interesting part of being a historian and also the frustrating part of being a historian. You mentioned that after this event takes place, so the troops are removed from Boston. When was this first referred to as a massacre?
Um, Pretty much right away. The Bostonians, New Englanders, they seize on the propaganda value of this massacre very, very quickly, and label it a massacre. And there's some historical controversy about that, which we can talk about. Was it a massacre if they were provoked and so forth, and sort of maybe even tricked into firing into the crowd? Do the colonists bear some responsibility too? Or was it I mean, 5 people were killed and shot by soldiers. So they were slain. So there was a massacre going on. So there's some debate about that. But very quickly, Paul Revere jumps into the mix, as does Samuel Adams, and there's this famous engraving that's sent out and published in the newspapers, and then published by other colonial newspapers. And so word of this massacre spreads very quickly. And I think we're going to talk about that engraving because it certainly has a great deal of propaganda value.
Yeah, let's bring up that image and look at it really quickly. Here is the famous print by Paul Revere. So I think this is in probably every US history textbook. I know this is something that I saw when I was little. It's in our US history resource. And Paul Revere publishes this 3 weeks after the event. And it's titled, it's hard to see at the top, but "The Bloody Massacre Perpetrated in King Street in Boston." And Tony, you mentioned that this is propaganda. So how does this further the cause of the Sons of Liberty and the idea that the British are tyrannical?
Right. Well, what we see here is that the British soldiers lined up, which they basically were that night, but they're lined up, and you see sort of these hapless and helpless colonists just innocently standing there and being mown down, by this volley, with Captain Preston in the back, raising a sword to fire. No one obviously had a snowball or a club in their hand or other missiles that they were throwing. And so it really seemed, at least on the face value for those who saw this, another example of just extreme tyranny that the British were now using their standing army of these redcoats to just fire into completely innocent civilians. Now, as I said, this is there's some truth to this picture. So I don't think we should just call it propaganda as to mean, well, it was untrue and gave a completely inaccurate view of the event. The British soldiers did fire into the crowd. They did kill 5 people, and they were provoked. Yes, we understand that. But I think it does, to some degree, accurately represent what happened, and also represents very, very clearly the colonists' feelings about the tyranny, right? Wrapped up in all this is the fear of standing armies, is the Townshend Acts and shutting down their legislatures. Sort of all of British tyranny is sort of encompassed in the colonial view in this engraving. So it's propaganda, yes, but I think we need to be very careful, because I think in today's world, when we teach young students about propaganda, we mean that it's just completely untrue. So
I think this image, so I think it's striking. You very clearly have the colonists on one side and the soldiers on the other. So I think even though there are some discrepancies like this, it doesn't look like nighttime in this print, but it looks more like daytime, but it's this us versus them. So I think the colonists, as you said, they were appealing to their idea, the rights of Englishmen to, represent themselves. And these rights are being taken away by the Englishmen who are quartered in their very city. So
right. And this is not just a matter of taxing them without their consent, or maybe a couple soldiers strolling around the streets, or even dissolving their legislature. I mean, this is actually murdering 5 people. This is slaying 5 people, and the colonists saw it in cold blood. And so this really represented kind of the apex of British tyranny. But what's interesting, and we can talk about this as we look at the effects of it, it doesn't really lead in the same way that some other events prior to it, led to kind of colonial outrage. People were outraged for a short time, but then you sort of have this calm, this lull over the next few years until we get, the Boston Tea Party and so forth. And so ironically, although it seems the apex of British tyranny, there's also this calm sort of in the wake of it.
We mentioned before that the events of the Boston Massacre, even Paul Revere's print, it's something that most Americans have seen or are familiar with. Speaking anecdotally, as for myself, and when I was a classroom teacher, the trial that follows the massacre, I think, is less well known, and I think a very interesting part of the story. So can you talk a little bit about that?
It's a really important part of the story. This was several months later. They're tried. As I said, the troops had been removed at least for a time to let calm be restored. Eventually, they were tried. And John Adams actually took the case he was a pretty well-known attorney and sort of involved, with the patriot movement, but didn't have the fame that he would have later on. And he actually takes the case because he really believed that the British soldiers were entitled to a fair trial, that they were entitled to justice, that they were accused of a crime and they had rights of the accused under the rights of Englishmen. It goes back to Magna Carta. This idea of a trial by jury is the right of every Englishman or colonist. And in fact, the colonists were often tried in British vice admiralty courts for violating the various taxes and for smuggling and so forth. And so they didn't receive a fair trial of their peers. But Adams and some others, this is a pretty unpopular cause, but Adams wants to prove that they can get a fair trial in America, even if the colonists are not getting a fair trial under the British. So he takes the case and he does something very interesting. He takes Captain Preston, who was in charge, he was the guy in back holding the sword, and the soldiers, and he splits their case. And he actually argues, and this is, from what I understand, not allowed today, but he argues contrary, conflicting arguments for their innocence. On one hand, he says Captain Preston did not give the order to fire. And then when he defended the soldiers, he said, no, they were just following orders. So you can't really do that. But he was able to do that. And despite some of these, legal shenanigans, if you will, he really did actually prove that the British soldiers hated, right? Killed 5 Americans, right? Sort of seemingly in cold blood. Yet they could receive a fair trial, that the evidence could be looked at, that jurors could be impaneled, and that they could hear the evidence, hear the witnesses, try to reconcile the confusing events from that night, and come to a decision about their guilt or innocence. And in fact, most were found innocent, except for 2 soldiers who were found guilty actually of manslaughter, but they received a very painful thumb branding with an M, and it basically told the world forever that they had been convicted of manslaughter, and that if they ever were accused of it again and convicted, they would be hanged as murderers. So they actually got off light, considering the alternative was hanging.
Yeah. I think two things strike me about your description of the trial. The first is that this was an unpopular cause from the point of view of the Americans. So I wonder if John Adams, were there any, threats against him, or did this cause a rift with Sam Adams over his decision to defend the British soldiers?
Right. Both those are true. This is a very unpopular cause, but, some of the important founders were no stranger to standing up for right principles, right, for constitutional principles, for natural right principles. And Alexander Hamilton will later, after the Revolutionary War is over, he will defend a number of Tories who had been pro-British, but had had their property stolen by other New Yorkers, or even allowed to do so by the New York legislature. But Hamilton took up their cause, right? And in both cases, and in other cases from the founding period, we have examples where people stood up for the right principles, even if it was unpopular, even if, you know, people criticized them, which happened in both cases, but they wanted to prove, you know, some of these rights to a fair trial, the idea of a natural right to justice, equality under the law. Both, you know, Adams and also Hamilton show that in America there's a rule of law, you know, that we would be governed by laws, not just capricious men, not just the will of people who sort of took the law into their own hands and did whatever they wanted and violated other people's rights. So I think that those are really important lessons to draw away from this trial and from other incidents in the founding period.
That's the second and more meaningful, I think, takeaway from your description of the trial is that, you know, this too, it's one thing to pay lip service to rule of law and innocence until proven guilty in a trial of your peers, but it's another thing to live it. And I think I almost think we need a retelling of the Boston Massacre, that it's not so much the event. I mean, not to downplay the event, the actual event of March 5th, 1770, but the trial that follows, I think, says much more about these principles that founders like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton that you mentioned, that this country is built on. Like, this is, I'm sure John Adams, well, I'm speculating, so let me not say that, but to take up that cause, which was very unpopular, but because of the principle, I think is incredibly brave. I don't think that any person would be able to do that. So I think to just really just pause for a moment and wrap your head around what that means and how difficult it is then, how difficult it is now, I think is really, really important.
No, I agree. I think it's a great example of courage and bravery, as you said. You know, the moral courage to do what is right. You know, we talk about that in our other BRI curricula. Certainly in Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. We do it in Heroes and Villains. We do it in our American Portrait series. We do it in a lot because we want to praise those men and women who have taken courageous stands and did what was right and stood up for basic principles and rights of the accused, or the rights of various minorities. And so, you know, BRI has a lot of curricula, you know, built around this very idea, that provides very, very good lessons, I think, for not only young people, but maybe even a lot of adult citizens in today's world, in our contentious times and all of that. I think it's really important to get back to these constitutional principles, natural right principles, but also civic virtues as well.
Paul Revere's print of this event definitely captures the drama of the massacre itself. And your essay in Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, BRI's new online resource, captures that drama and the drama of everything leading up to it. Like you said before in our talk, you know, it was really a powder keg and blood is boiling. And the courtroom drama, the drama of, you know, John Adams taking this case. So I think that maybe one of the reasons this event it stands out so much in our history and our memory is because of the drama and the, you know, just the narrative, the story is so compelling. And I know that's something that we really strive to capture in the stories in Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness.
Right. No, I think I did. I tried to, and you know, all of the members of our team tried to draw that out, and as well as the 100+ scholars that we worked with, we tried to really capture, you know, the drama and excitement of history. You know, we try to appeal to students' intellects as well with all of our analytical materials. But there's a great deal of inherent drama in American history, and we really try to draw that out, as well as the constitutional principles, the civic virtues, and really try to appeal to the students' souls as well. with good storytelling. And I think that's really what separates this textbook from any other textbook that I've ever seen, in my 15-year teaching career. So that's why I'm really excited about it, and was really excited to be a part of creating this wonderful textbook for teachers and students.
Absolutely. It's a wonderful balance of the passion, the drama, right? These moments in the past that we didn't know the outcome at the time, and also thinking critically and asking questions and being curious. So definitely, if you're watching, check out Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. We'll put a link to it in the comments of our conversation today. Tony, thank you so much for taking the time to talk us through the Boston Massacre and the trial that followed. And thank you guys for watching, and we hope that you will come back and check us out with another Scholar Talk in the near future.
Thanks, Mary.